So my project today is going to be looking at sex offenders. I'm going to be going over the definition of a sex offender. I'm going to be looking at sex offense from the role of fantasy. And then I'm going to get in a discussion of how sex offenders look from the circles of sexuality model, the social justice model, and lastly, how to incorporate trauma-informed care into treatment of sex offenders. So I hope you enjoy the presentation. Thank you. What is a sex offender? A sex offender is a person that has been convicted of a sexual crime. There are a range of crimes that can label a person as a sex offender, and a person who has committed a sexual crime must register themselves as a sex offender. And this is a process that varies from state to state depending on the level of the sexual offense. Looking at New York State specifically, again, there are a wide range of sexual crimes that are punishable by law. A few examples are luring a child, sodomy, forcible touching, sex trafficking, or promoting or possessing a sexual performance by a child. I'm going to look at this from the perspective of sexual fantasy. So, sexual fantasy is any mental image or thought that creates arousal or is erotic to an individual. It's a universal phenomenon, meaning all individuals have fantasies. Individuals may fantasize about acts that are offense specific and would be illegal if acted upon. For example, rape is one of the most common fantasies, but as you know, most individuals don't actually act on that. Individuals with deviant sexual fantasy are more likely to act on sexual offenses. Deviant fantasy becomes more dangerous depending on how specific the individual makes it. For example, a person can have an ambiguous fantasy about raping a person. However, it gets dangerous when the person starts thinking of a specific individual that they know they want to rape. They think of a place or a location where they would want to commit this act, and they get off on the power and control they feel when having the fantasy. I've highlighted the process of taking a deviant sexual fantasy and putting it into action. So there's the initial fantasy, the makeup of the plan, considering a time, location, how you would lure this person into that place, the actual setup of it, then committing the action, followed by the consequence or being punished by law and being labeled as a sex offender. A profile of sex offenders. Many sex offenders have a history of abuse and neglect and sexual abuse in their childhood. Between 58% and 94% of sex offenders have a mental disorder, and I've highlighted the specific breakdown of those disorders. And sex offenders engage in unhealthy and ineffective coping skills when presented with stressful and traumatic situations. Considering the circles of sexuality, sex offenders have developed unhealthy sexual scripts and cognitive distortions regarding sex and their own and other sexuality. To highlight a few specific examples, for sensuality, as discussed, sex offenders do engage in and act on deviant sexual fantasies. Regarding intimacy, many sex offenders come from a background of abuse and neglect and have not learned what a healthy form of intimacy is. For sexual identity and sexualization, many sex offenders themselves grew up in homes where they were over sexualized and given unhealthy messages about sex from the time they were young. Given that these were the messages that they received, this is how they acted when sex later became a part of their life. Research shows that sex offenders have cognitive distortions, and one of the most common ones is thinking that women are deceptive and luring them into their behavior, and those are some of the things that help sex offenders justify their actions. From the social justice model, there are laws and public policy that have been put into place to protect members of society, specifically children, from sexual offenders and from becoming victims. One of the most common ones is Megan's Law, and that was established to mandate that every state has a community notification procedure set in place to allow people to know that a sex offender is living in their neighborhood. And this also helps to enforce the registration process that sex offenders have to go through. Looking at trauma history, studies show that early childhood trauma, psychological stress, and unhealthy coping skills all contribute to individuals becoming sexual offenders. Sex offenders have high incidence of childhood neglect, physical maltreatment, emotional abuse, and sexual abuse. Research shows that sex offenders have higher rates of all of these factors when compared to offenders of non sexual crimes. So, how does this incorporate trauma informed care? Most treatment with sex offenders focuses on relapse prevention, learning triggers, avoiding high risk situations, and distorted thinking. This is all important in the treatment of sex offenders. However, incorporating trauma informed care into already existing treatment models would allow for a more holistic approach to the individual. It would allow the individual to look at their unhealthy behavior through a trauma lens and help them to learn their patterns of interaction and unhealthy coping skills they have developed to reduce risk of further offending. Specifically looking at each principle, for safety, it'd be about creating a safe environment where a client can work on treatment and not be judged for their crime. Choice, allowing individuals to explore all aspects of past trauma and impact on patterns of interaction. Trustworthiness, creating a client centered environment where clients can explore both their past and their crime free of judgment. Collaboration, working with the individual and other factors in their lives to promote recovery. And empowerment, encouraging clients that recovery and re entry into society is possible. And these are the references that I used for my presentation.